Hi, it's Mohammed Jama. I'm one of the TAs for Education and International Development. In today's mini lecture, we're going to talk about secondary education, specifically the challenges in access and equity in secondary education. The structure of this mini lecture is going to be a summary of the article, followed by an analysis / critique of the article. The two articles that we're going to be discussing today is it's the Friedrichsen and Fosberg article, and the second one is the Murphy-Graham article. So the first article by Friedrichsen and Fosberg, The Case for Investing in Secondary Education in Sub-Saharan Africa, Challenges and Opportunities. So, to summarize this article, it covers the challenge of meeting the growing demand for secondary education in sub-Saharan Africa currently and in the next couple of decades as the young people's share of the population dramatically increases. And so the paper discusses what countries in the sub-Saharan region need to do in order to first catch up with the rest of the global south and also to keep up with the growing demand created by the pressure of population growth, particularly among the younger demographics. Secondary education plays a pivotal role in the development of individuals as well as countries, particularly in meeting the demands of the economy. Crucially, it serves as a pathway for integrating people into the labor market while simultaneously channeling others into higher education. Without it, the authors argue, economic development will be stunted, especially in the transition from an agrarian-based economy to a manufacturing and service sector-led economy. And this requires the kind of skills one would obtain from higher level learning at the secondary, vocational, and tertiary levels. Sub-Saharan Africa faces enormous challenges in enrollment, completion, and equitable access to secondary education. This is, of course, rooted in the colonial history of the region, in which education historically served the purpose of preparing administrators to run the machinery of government. The legacy of the colonial period is such that access to education today in sub-Saharan Africa is limited not only by family income, either through school fees or the need to work to make ends meet, but also by gender. Girls drop out earlier and at much higher percentages than boys, particularly in rural areas. In addition, the inequity in access increases by the level of education. And so by the upper secondary and tertiary levels, you will find a significant underrepresentation of girls and women and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And so accessing and completing education, especially at the secondary level, is not only key in breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty, it is indispensable to fostering economic development in the region. However, the authors argue that the challenge is not only about inequitable access, but also the insufficient quality and relevance of education in the region to the needs of the contemporary labor market, which explains in part the high rate of unemployment and underemployment of graduates from secondary and tertiary levels of education. To overcome these challenges, Friedrichsen and Fosberg recommend creating second chance programs to youth who drop out of primary or secondary schools, expanding the definition of basic education to include lower secondary school, which in Kenya is probably up to standard 8, and this is to improve access. They also recommend reforming the curriculum to make it more relevant to labor market demands and improve and increase access to technical and vocational education and training to more holistically serve the requirements of the economy and to provide alternative avenues for students. To fund these demands for improved and enlarged access to education, governments in sub-Saharan Africa will need to diversify their sources of revenue away from dependency on foreign aid to include taxes from the national economy, funding from the private sector, as well as reducing the unit cost of schooling. So that is the summary of the article, more or less, and now the analysis. Friedrichsen and Fosberg convincingly make the link between increased access to quality education, particularly at the secondary level, and readiness for improved economic development. In this regard, they make reference to the examples of the East Asian countries whose strong economic performance has in part been attributable to their move toward universal access to secondary education. In fact, sub-Saharan Africa lags behind all of the regions of the Global South, including South Asia and Latin America, in terms of share enrollment and equitable access to secondary education. Where I'm unconvinced, however, is when the article uncritically makes the assumption that sub-Saharan African countries can replicate the success of the export-led growth model of the East Asian so-called tiger economies, a model which may not be suitable for historic, environmental, and political reasons for sub-Saharan Africa. There's an absence of a discussion about Africa's historically peripheral or marginal role within the capitalist world economy as a source of cheap raw materials and labor for the core or main economies of the global north. The improved economic development of East Asia has in large part been due to the improved access of Asian companies and producers to the rich markets of North America, Europe, and Australia in the last 30 or 40 years. What countries in East Asia, particularly China, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, achieved was far fairer integration to the global economy, which is so often denied to other countries in the global south, especially sub-Saharan Africa. For example, agrarian-based economies in sub-Saharan Africa face enormous difficulties in exporting their produce to markets in the European Union and the US due to tariffs and unfair subsidies for local agriculture, thereby making African producers massively uncompetitive. It is therefore difficult to imagine how African countries could fund the kind of expanded public education that is recommended in this article without improved economic performance, which will ultimately require better access to the developed markets of the global north, as long as we're going to be in a globalized world economy. Irrespective of whether those economies in sub-Saharan Africa are dominated by agriculture, as it currently is, and other resources, or whether they move towards manufacturing and service-based sectors. Although the article specifically mentions the sub-Saharan African region as being a decade behind other regions of the global south in terms of access to education, there's a lack of explanation for why that is. It is often referred to as Africa's lost decade of economic development, and this was in large part brought on by the fall of commodity prices and the debt crisis of the 1980s, and crucially the Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAPs as they were known, which were imposed on countries in the global south by the international financial institutions, namely the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, and even up to now. These policies, which are known as neoliberal economics, include the privatization of state enterprises, as well as cuts to public spending in health and education, and other key drivers of individual and economic capacity development. These policies were forced on other countries as well, including in parts of the global north, but the most negatively impacted were the least economically developed states in the global south, of which sub-Saharan Africa has the largest share of numbers. Though it is logical to suggest that funding for expanded access to education should come from better taxation as economies develop, it is reasonable to assume that this economic development will require withdrawing the neoliberal economic policies of the international financial institutions, which have hindered the economic development of sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, we cannot make economic reasons alone for why we need to invest in increasing access to secondary education. The benefits of expanded quality education in the sub-Saharan region includes the potential for a more informed, engaged, and inclusive citizenry, which contributes to long-term peaceful and democratic development. And in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a region that has been affected not only by economic stagnation, we also see challenges brought on by climate change and political conflict. And so what we need to do is to have a more holistic approach to education and its role in development. The second article that we are covering in this mini lecture is the Murphy-Graham article, Constructing a New Vision, Undoing Gender Through Secondary Education in Honduras. Murphy-Graham's article discusses findings from the Honduran Secondary Education Program, SAT, which sought to undo gender through participants' conscientization or awareness of gender oppression in the domestic sphere. The SAT program took a gender mainstreaming approach whereby gender is connected to broader issues of justice. Students would discuss questions of gender through a dialogical approach, through the facilitation of a tutor who supports student learning. And it also included a weekly study group which fit in with the students' family and economic obligations. It also included students disseminating what they learned to their community, as well as seeking the support of the local community to not only subsidize the cost of learning resources, but also to help in the building of classrooms. Typically, when students finish all of the SAT textbooks and practical activities, which take normally about 6 years, students would receive the equivalent of a secondary school certificate. The article also utilizes the gender mainstreaming framework in which the awareness of gender roles and oppression is embedded in the curriculum, and proposes that undoing gender requires individual and structural changes. As results from Murphy-Graham's study showed, over time, attitudinal and behavioral changes among the women and their male partners about gender roles and more importantly, changes in the division of labor in the home were observed. The analysis. And so the article makes a laudable effort in proposing a model that addresses some of the persistent challenges to gender equity in access to education in the global South. Part of that challenge is, of course, the continuing sole role of women and girls in social reproduction or housework and childcare responsibilities in the family setting. These responsibilities place a heavy burden in terms of time on women and girls, which eventually becomes a barrier to the individual's pursuit of educational and career development. And so we need to find effective ways to address these gender disparities. That is very obvious. And overall, the article does a fairly good job in showing how a thoughtfully crafted program can begin to address the almost daunting challenge of, as the author puts it, undoing gender differences in social interactions. However, as I shall point out here, there are a few shortcomings with the article that bears consideration. The first is the concept of gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is a concept which emerged from the 1985 Third World Conference on Women in Nairobi, and which was formally adopted at the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. The idea of gender mainstreaming is to incorporate a gendered lens in government policy and legislation with a view to ameliorating or addressing and eventually eliminating gender disparities. And so as a consequence, the idea entailed changing programs and budgets to be more gender sensitive. Critics, however, have charged that gender mainstreaming has done little to address and to change the lives of women, especially in the global South. And gender mainstreaming is criticized for often being an afterthought in development programs and has suffered from poor implementation, shifting policy priorities, and resistant institutional cultures. And so the article, unfortunately, does not place gender mainstreaming in the context of this ongoing debate and perhaps uncritically accepts it. The second issue is the issue of social reproduction and the public and domestic spheres. The article's almost exclusive focus on changing social reproduction disregards how domination in the domestic sphere within the family is compounded and reinforced by legal statutes and social norms in the public sphere, for instance, in the labor market, where women are disproportionately overrepresented in the informal sector by an elite and male-dominated political system, and anti-women reproductive health policies, unfavorable family laws, particularly around divorce, and indifference to gender-based violence in the legal system. Thus, the focus on raising awareness about and changing the social reproduction of labor in the home here in this article discounts and perhaps minimizes the institutional nature and the resilience of gendered oppression, as well to fixate on the domestic lives of women to the exclusion of their public existence replicates the idea of women's lives as being tied solely to biological reproduction and family life. So the second last issue is the issue of intersectionality. Although the article talks about how gender oppression happens concurrently with other forms of oppression, the article eventually neglects to discuss how the program may or may not have taken an intersectional approach. An intersectional approach or intersectionality is about discussing how gender oppression happens concurrently with or simultaneously with other forms of oppression, including racial marginalization, class marginalization, and linguistic discrimination, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in the program, if the program exclusively focused on undoing gender in the context of the home and the family to the exclusion of intersecting oppressions, we might ask if this program approaches women's marginalization through the prism or the lens of gender alone. Which is a perspective that can be quite reductive. For instance, the article mentions the Garifuna community of Honduras, which is of African descent and faces systemic racism in Honduras, but it says very little about how the curriculum of the SAT program addressed the matrix of racial marginalization, gender subjugation, and poverty that must confront Black Honduran women. One might wonder if the program, if the SAT program, is about solely about changing participant attitudes, an individualistic approach not incompatible with neoliberal policy prescriptions that I talked about in the earlier article, and not actually about building an awareness of gendered oppression in a more holistic manner that accounts for the role of institutions of race and ethnic, as well as language and class discrimination, and other factors inhibiting gender equality. The last issue that I want to talk about in this article is the role of the tutor. And my concern centers around the ad hoc or informal nature of the tutor's role. Who is supposed to be facilitating the curriculum of the SAT program. There's a concern on my part as a teacher about the precariousness or unstable nature of this position, as I believe that an educator not only needs to be properly trained with a degree of subject matter expertise or knowledge corresponding to the level of schooling, but also himself or herself needs a stable source of income and institutional support for ongoing capacity building. And indeed, in the study, Murphy Graham mentions that and I quote, in the comparison village, the SAT program had been implemented. However, it was discontinued after just 3 months due to the unreliability of the tutor. This can be found. This quote can be found on page 510. And so this unsuccessful implementation suggests to me that we simply cannot ignore the central role of the educator, whether it be a teacher in the traditional sense or a tutor in this case in student learning and program viability. And so we also need to be cautious here about reproducing neoliberal social policies which have made the teaching profession an increasingly insecure vocation, including in parts of the global north. I want to thank you for listening to me. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me or to ask your tutors at the Skype session on Saturday and Monday. Take care.